But first, if you believe children's lives matter, if you think the truth deserves to be heard, then prove it.
Subscribe now.
Because every subscriber is a voice demanding justice for Jack and Lilly Sullivan. Forensic specialists immediately began processing the scene. They found DNA evidence confirming that both Lilly and Jack had been held in that cabin for extended periods. Hair samples, fingerprints, and biological evidence painted a picture of two children who had been confined in that remote location for weeks, possibly months. More disturbing were the security measures that had been installed. Heavy-duty locks on the bedroom doors, windows that had been nailed shut, and what appeared to be a monitoring system that would have allowed someone to watch the children remotely. But investigators also found evidence that gave them hope. Recent food wrappers, warm ashes in the fireplace, and most importantly, children's vitamins with dates showing they had been purchased just days earlier. Someone had been caring for Lilly and Jack, keeping them alive, and the evidence suggested they had been moved very recently. Meanwhile, the other 5 tactical teams were executing search warrants on properties connected to the identified co-conspirators. At a storage unit rented under a false name, investigators found backpack liners, camping equipment, and what appeared to be supplies for a long-term camping trip. At another location, a rental property that had been paid for in cash for 6 months in advance, investigators found evidence of planning that went far beyond what they had already uncovered. Maps of remote areas throughout the maritime provinces, research on abandoned properties, and most chilling of all, identification documents that appeared to be forgeries for 2 young children. The implications were staggering. This conspiracy hadn't just been about hiding Lilly and Jack temporarily. Someone had been preparing to give them completely new identities and disappear with them permanently. But the most significant breakthrough came at the primary residence of Molly's identified co-conspirator. When tactical teams breached the property, they found Molly Brooks Murray herself, along with the man whose voice had been identified in the Janey recordings. The arrest was dramatic but anticlimactic. Both suspects surrendered without resistance, almost as if they had been expecting this moment. But their demeanor was what investigators found most disturbing. Neither showed any emotion about being caught, and neither immediately asked about the children's whereabouts. It was as if they had already mentally moved on from whatever had happened to Lilly and Jack. During initial processing, investigators made a discovery that would change everything. In Molly's purse, they found a handwritten note that appeared to be directions to another location. The note was cryptic, mostly compass directions and landmark references, but it clearly indicated yet another property that investigators hadn't identified. More importantly, the note was recent. The ink was fresh, the paper was new, and most significantly, there were small handprints on the paper, the kind that might be left by children who had handled it recently. As investigators raced to decode the directions in the note, they received word that changed the entire dynamic of the operation. A cab driver in a town nearly 2 hours away had come forward after seeing news coverage of the arrests. He reported that just 3 days earlier, he had picked up a woman and 2 young children from a remote location and driven them to a bus station. The description of the woman matched neither Molly nor anyone else investigators had identified as part of the conspiracy. But his description of the children, a blonde girl around 6 years old and a younger boy with distinctive freckles, matched Lilly and Jack Sullivan perfectly. Most importantly, the cab driver reported that the children had seemed scared and confused, repeatedly asking where they were going and when they could go home. The woman with them had claimed to be their aunt and said they were moving to live with relatives in another province. The bus station's security footage confirmed the cab driver's story. Grainy images showed 2 small figures being led onto a bus bound for New Brunswick. The timestamp on the footage was just 72 hours before the arrests were made. Lilly and Jack Sullivan were alive, but they were now potentially hundreds of kilometers away from home, traveling with someone whose identity and intentions remained unknown. The investigation had evolved from a search and rescue operation into a multi-provincial manhunt. Amber alerts were issued across the maritime provinces. Border services were notified in case the children were being transported out of the country. And investigators began the painstaking process of tracking bus routes, passenger manifests, and security footage from multiple transportation hubs. But they also began interrogating Molly Brooks Murray and her co-conspirator, desperate to understand who else was involved in this conspiracy and where Lilly and Jack were being taken. What they learned in those interrogation rooms would reveal that the conspiracy was even more extensive than they had imagined. The plan to make 2 children disappear hadn't ended with hiding them in remote cabins. It had evolved into something far more permanent, far more sinister. Someone had been preparing to take Lilly and Jack so far from their old lives that they might never be found. And that someone was still out there, traveling with 2 terrified children who had no idea that an entire province was desperately searching for them. The race to find them had become a race against time, geography, and a conspiracy that seemed to have contingency plans for every possible scenario. But investigators were determined that this story would not end with 2 children disappearing forever into the vastness of Canada. The performance was over. The arrests had been made. But the most crucial act of this tragedy was still playing out somewhere on the highways and backroads of eastern Canada, where 2 innocent children were being carried further away from home with each passing hour. The interrogation rooms at RCMP headquarters became the epicenter of a psychological battle that would determine whether Lilly and Jack Sullivan would ever see their family again. Investigators faced 2 suspects who had spent months perfecting their deception, and now they needed to break through that deception to find 2 children who were getting further from home with each passing hour. Molly Brooks Murray sat across from investigators with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout her months of public appearances. But now, faced with overwhelming evidence and the knowledge that her conspiracy had been exposed, investigators hoped to see cracks in the facade she had maintained for so long. The approach was methodical. Investigators laid out the evidence piece by piece: the torn blanket with Lilly's DNA, the cell phone records that destroyed her alibi, the trunk contents that tied her directly to the children's disappearance, the voice recordings that revealed her rehearsed responses. With each piece of evidence presented, investigators watched for any sign that Molly's emotional walls were cracking. But what they saw was something far more disturbing than they had expected. As the evidence mounted, instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Molly began to exhibit what psychologists would later describe as narcissistic pride in her own planning. If you're feeling angry right now, if you're frustrated by the injustice of it all, then channel that energy into action. Subscribe to this channel right now, because if you won't even click a button to support the search for truth in cases like this, then what does that say about your commitment to justice? And if you're not going to subscribe, then at least tell us why in the comments. What's stopping you from standing up for Jack and Lilly Sullivan? You have no idea how much work this took, she said during one particularly chilling exchange. Months of planning, coordinating with multiple people, managing every detail. And we almost pulled it off. The casual way she discussed making her own children disappear, as if it were a complex project she had managed rather than a horrific crime, revealed the depth of her emotional detachment from Lilly and Jack as human beings. But investigators needed more than confessions about the planning. They needed to know who else was involved and, most critically, where the children were now. The breakthrough came when investigators revealed that they had security footage from the bus station showing Lilly and Jack being led away by an unknown woman. For the first time since her arrest, Molly's composed facade cracked. Not with remorse or concern for her children's safety, but with anger that this part of the plan had been captured on camera. That wasn't supposed to happen in view of security cameras, she muttered, more to herself than to investigators. The comment revealed that even this final stage of making the children disappear had been carefully planned to avoid detection. Under continued pressure, Molly began to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. The plan had always involved multiple stages, she explained. First, create the appearance that the children had wandered off and gotten lost. When that inevitably failed due to intensive search efforts, move to stage 2, hide them in remote locations while maintaining the fiction that they were still missing in the wilderness. But there had always been a stage 3, a final contingency plan that Molly described with chilling matter-of-factness. If the deception was ever discovered, if investigators ever got close to finding the children in their hiding places, then Lilly and Jack would be moved one final time to locations where they would never be found. They were never meant to come back, Molly said, her voice devoid of any maternal emotion. From the beginning, this was about making them disappear permanently. Everything else was just buying time until we could execute the final phase. The final phase, investigators learned, involved a network of people who specialized in making children disappear permanently. Not killers, Molly insisted, but people who could relocate children to situations where they would be raised under completely new identities, far from anyone who might recognize them. It was a human trafficking operation disguised as a missing children case, and Molly had been willing to sell her own children into it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They weren't just dealing with a family conspiracy anymore. They were dealing with an organized network that had experience making children disappear permanently. And Lilly and Jack were currently in the hands of people who viewed them not as individuals with families who loved them, but as commodities to be relocated and sold. Meanwhile, the co-conspirator was providing additional details that painted an even more disturbing picture. The entire plan had been motivated not by mental illness or desperation, but by financial gain. Molly had been paid a substantial sum of money to make her children available to this trafficking network. She was in debt, the co-conspirator revealed. Gambling debts, credit card debts, money she owed to some very dangerous people. Someone approached her with an offer. Make your kids disappear, and all your financial problems go away. The children had been commodified, treated as assets to be liquidated to solve their mother's financial problems. But investigators also learned crucial information about the network's operations. The woman who had been captured on bus station security footage was described as a transporter, someone who specialized in moving children between different stages of the trafficking process. These transporters typically operated on predetermined routes with predetermined safe houses where children could be held temporarily while documentation was prepared and final destinations were arranged. The goal was to move children far enough from their original locations that local missing persons investigations would be unlikely to track them. Armed with this information, investigators began working with federal agencies and international child trafficking specialists to identify possible routes and destinations. The bus that Lilly and Jack had been placed on was tracked to its final destination in New Brunswick, where security footage showed the woman and 2 children disembarking and transferring to a different vehicle. From there, the trail became more complex. Traffic cameras captured images of vehicles matching the description heading toward different border crossings. Some headed toward the United States, others toward more remote areas of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, where they could disappear into rural communities. But investigators had one advantage that the trafficking network might not have anticipated. The extensive media coverage of Lilly and Jack's disappearance had made their faces recognizable across the maritime provinces. While this might have complicated rescue efforts by forcing the traffickers to keep the children hidden, it also meant that any public sighting would likely be reported immediately. The break came from an unexpected source, a convenience store clerk in a small New Brunswick town who recognized 2 children from the Amber Alert photos. The woman with them had claimed they were her grandchildren, but something about their interaction had seemed wrong to the clerk. The kids looked scared, the clerk reported. They kept looking around like they were hoping someone would recognize them. And when I asked their names, the woman answered for them instead of letting them speak. Security footage from the convenience store confirmed the sighting. Enhanced images clearly showed Lilly and Jack Sullivan, alive but obviously distressed, being led back to a vehicle by a woman who matched the description from the bus station footage. The timestamp on the convenience store footage was less than 12 hours old. For the first time since the bus station sighting, investigators had a recent location and a direction of travel. Multiple tactical teams were deployed throughout New Brunswick, focusing on the rural areas where the traffickers would most likely try to hide while they arranged final transportation for the children. Helicopter surveillance was coordinated with ground teams, and every highway leading out of the province was monitored. But investigators knew they were racing against more than just time and geography. They were racing against a network of people who had experience evading law enforcement and who viewed 2 terrified children as nothing more than a business transaction to be completed. The question that haunted every investigator involved in the search was whether they would find Lilly and Jack before the trafficking network could complete whatever final arrangements they were making. Because once these children disappeared into the underground network that had been designed to hide them permanently, the chances of ever finding them again would become virtually zero. If you're someone who believes children deserve justice, who thinks the truth matters more than protecting lies, then you need to subscribe right now. Because if you won't stand up for missing children by hitting that subscribe button, then honestly, what will you stand up for? And if you're not going to subscribe, at least have the courage to tell us why in the comments.